Welcome to episode 8 of The Lowdown Show. I'm Neil Graham. My guest this week is one of my favorite people in the motorcycle business, Andy Goldfine. He runs the Duluth, Minnesota company called Aerostich, and they make the Roadcrafter suit, which is sort of a glorified garbage bag. Andy won't like that, but I say that with all affection. Andy started this company in the 80s, made something that no one ever expected, and then turned this business into a really interesting cottage industry success. Andy is incredibly smart, has opinions about everything, and you'll enjoy this even if you don't know who he is. But before we dive in, a word from our sponsor. eBay Motors is here for the ride. With some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber and not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only and exclusions apply. Shall we take the plunge? Andy, how did you get from being, as I understand it, a philosophy student to a garment manufacturer in Duluth, Minnesota? How did that begin?
A confluence of things happen. You know, everything in life is, I think, about timing, being in the right place at the right time, and then making the right decisions. There was no plan. It was just getting up every day and what looks like the next best thing to do right in front of you. So the step of getting to be a philosophy major was, I was relatively purposeless when I entered college, and I picked courses that I liked. And 2/3 of the way through the undergraduate degree, I was called into a counseling meeting with someone, and they said, "You're all over the place. You've got a welding class here, you've got a history class there, you've got a philosophy class here. I think we better create a major that we call the interdisciplinary major, because you're all over the place." And I said, "I don't want to have an interdisciplinary major. I want a regular, traditional major-minor combination so that when someone asks me what I studied in college, I can say I studied chemistry and physics or philosophy and this." And so my response to this counselor was, "What is the traditional major-minor combination that has the least number of required core credits?" And that was a philosophy major and an English minor. So I said, "I want that."
That doesn't tell me how you ended up making motorcycle gear in Duluth. So take me through that step. How did that happen? And what were you as a motorcyclist at the time? Were you a keen motorcyclist? Were you a motorcyclist at all?
I was a keen motorcyclist before I was a motorcyclist, before I had a motorcycle. I was one of these free-range kids who had a bicycle as a child, a 20-inch bicycle. I can take you to the exact spot where my mother put her hand behind the little saddle on my first 20 feet of riding without training wheels, and my life changed. The training wheels came off the bicycle. And after that, I was the late for dinner kid. Where have you been and why? You know, and I would ride our little city has 85,000 people. At the time, it had 106, I think. But I went all over the place in our city and always was late for dinner. When I was about 14 or 15, I decided I needed to have a mini bike. And in those days, mini bikes used lawnmower engines and centrifugal clutches. The brake pedal was usually a piece of steel that pressed against the back tire. And I bought a used one for $100, which was all I had, and saved for between allowance and getting paid for chores. I bought this brush painted, homemade, lawnmower powered mini bike. And it took me about a week to blow up the engine. And then I spent a year saving money to buy a new Briggs & Stratton engine to replace that one. And then I turned 16 and was gifted. At the time, a Honda 90 motorcycle was anywhere from $275 American dollars to $390 American dollars, depending on the version, the model. And for my 16th birthday, my parents, who did not ride, or nobody in my family rode, but they knew how I felt about motorcycles, gifted me as a 16th birthday present a Honda 90. And I lived in the basement of a mid-century modern house, and my bedroom was in the basement. And for the first 2 weeks of having that bike at night, after everyone in my family had gone to bed, I would go out to the garage and push it into my bedroom through the downstairs part of the house till my mother caught on. And that was then forbidden. And that's how I began to, as a motorcyclist. I was a motorcycle. If there is such a thing as being born a rider, I was a rider from birth. I just loved it.
And what is it about riding that resonates with you? And does it still resonate the same way that it did when you were 16?
It does. And that's one of the most interesting things in my memory of when I was in high school. I rode to high school classes on a little Honda. And after high school, I would occasionally run into class. I wasn't a popular kid in school, but I would 2 or 3 years later, I ran into a high school mate. Oh, Andy, are you still riding those motorcycles? And that happened 2 or 3 times in my early 20s. And I kept thinking I was going to grow out of that because I kept getting the feedback. People are mirrors to who you are. And the mirror reflection I kept getting from others around me who knew me was that motorcycling was something kids did and grew out of. And I guess when I was probably 27 or 28, riding dirt bikes on Saturdays and Sundays with my buddies, one of my buddies said, let's do some AMA enduros. And I argued, no, we don't want to screw that. We're having fun on trail rides. But eventually he persuaded me to go do enduros, which got me practicing and doing exercises to be fitter and working on my bike to make it work better and stuff like that. And the more I did of those, I did 2 years of those in this AMA district. And I was using a Can-Am with a lighting coil like a snowmobile so that it had no brake light, it had no turn signals, it had nothing that made it a street legal vehicle, yet Minnesota issued a license plate to it. So I was riding around, going to my job on this very illegal but licensed Can-Am. And I thought at that moment, somewhere in that year or two, I thought, I'm not going to outgrow this. I'm going to do this the rest of my life. And that made me decide, that mental shift made me decide that I needed a legit street bike, something with a horn and turn signals and a battery and high beam and all the rest of the stuff. And so a year or two before I started Aerostich, again, putting one foot in front of the other as I moved through my life, I ended up at 28 or something with 2 motorcycles. I chose a used BMW because I wanted a street bike that had a light enough weight and long enough suspension so that I could ride on dirt and gravel roads easily. And the Japanese street bikes of that time did not have the suspension to be good gravel road bikes. I put dual sport tires on a 1,000cc BMW before there were GSs, and was using it on a gravel road and sliding it around, even though the cylinder was in the way. And that was 2 years before Aerostich. And so I came to the conclusion that I wasn't going to outgrow riding. And then the next step came along, which was the start of Aerostich. In the working part of my life, I had a real estate license. I was representing a commercial real estate business and didn't like it, wasn't very happy. And at that same time, the garment industry was being offshored to Asia. And you could buy industrial sewing equipment for nothing almost. And I was called in to help a family member auction and liquidate a sewing factory. And the deal I made was that I was going to get some of the sewing machines as payment. This was sort of a moonlighting job while I had this real estate license. And I ended up with 16 sewing machines. The plant had about 130 sewing machines. Yeah, and I organized the auction and took the sewing machines and rented a warehouse space for $500 a month.
Well, let me jump in here. Now, when you took the sewing machines, did you know what you were going to do with them?
No, I did not. They were made for, the industrial sewing equipment is made for specific things. So if you want to make t-shirts, you have one kind of sewing machine. If you want to make jeans, you have another kind of sewing machine. If you want to make winter coats, you have another kind. This factory was making winter coats and snowmobile suits and stuff like that. So I had equipment for that kind of industrial sewing. I've always enjoyed making things. When I was in kindergarten and they gave you clay to make an ashtray for your parents or something, I thought that was a lot of fun. So I liked, just like riding, I liked making stuff. And so I got these sewing machines and figured out how to set them up and make them sew. And then I started looking around for what I might be able to make with them. And I looked at every activity that I had even a tangential familiarity with. I knew a little bit about fishing. Could I make a better fly fishing vest? I looked at what was out there. No, I didn't think I could do that. I looked at life jackets, flotation things, and could I make better flotation thing than somebody? No, I couldn't. Could I make a better ski jacket for downhill skiers? No, I couldn't, etc. And it took about a year of thought experiments or analytics or whatever you want to call it. And I came to the conclusion, since I had very little money, that the best thing to do would be sort of what in football, the analogy is a Hail Mary pass. If your team is way down behind, you put some guy in the end zone and you throw it and hope he catches it. And my logic was I should pioneer a coverall with armor for using a motorcycle instead of having to get leathers or a wax cotton touring suit or wear a windbreaker like Steve McQueen or whatever. I wanted a coverall. And the reason I wanted this for myself is where I live and where I wanted to spend the rest of my life living was in northern Minnesota next to Lake Superior. And we have highly variable and mostly not great weather for riding a motorcycle. And I wanted to be able to ride year round. So I thought a coverall would be a solution to that. And maybe somebody would like that solution outside of me. And I figured I could make a living with one or two helpers, making 100 garments a year. And nobody made, everything in life is made to a recipe. A chair or a food item, it's a recipe. And the recipe for the armored coverall that I came up with was a new recipe for how to dress to use a motorcycle. And for the first 10 years, most riders laughed at this new recipe. And motorcycle magazine editors, who were considered experts, were some of the loudest people who laughed. They didn't understand it. So it took a long time to get this recipe popular. And the experience that riders who were early adopters had is they would put it on, go for their first ride, and start giggling into their helmet because it was more comfortable, more windproof. You felt different than you felt zipped into leathers or wearing wax cotton. It was just easy. It was convenient. It was light. Nobody really knew how crash or abrasion resistant it would be. We had done experiments dragging sandbags down highways to pick what fabrics we were using and knew that it was sort of going to be good. The conceptual breakthrough besides the new recipe was that unlike leathers, this was intended to be as light as possible so that after a good crash, let's say you crashed at 90 miles an hour and slid 100 yards down a highway, my logic was, well, then you buy a new one. And a leather jacket, when I grew up and the older, more experienced riders would have a horsehide or cowhide jacket or riding gear, they could point to the shoulder and say, this is where I crashed in 63. It's all rubbed out. And this is where I crashed, and the jacket was relatively rebuildable and reusable. And I did not want to wear 14 pounds of leather just to go to a job across town.
It's kind of a bizarre concept for a business, truly, isn't it? When you think that, nobody was doing it.
Nobody was.
And you live in a place like I live in Canada, which is, not exactly conducive to motorcycling, although I would argue that makes us more interested in it because we can't do it most of the time because we have to just think about it.
True. That's true.
So we end up philosophizing about motorcycling more than we actually do it, unlike someone in Southern California who just goes and does it. But this, did you have any sense of how many people would want to wear a giant kind of canvas bag to go motorcycling in. And what were the competing products at the time in term? What year is this, Andy, when you started?
83.
So what in terms of, other than a leather jacket or waxed cotton, was that kind of it, or what were touring riders wearing at the time?
You asked two questions. I'm going to answer them separately. I made two scenarios in my imagination. One was the worst case and one was the best case, because there was no way to determine before trying if it would work. Worst case scenario is that it would be me and one or two people in a basement somewhere making these suits for 100 people a year who wanted to commute. The best case scenario is people would look at this coverall with armor and reflective and vents and all the stuff that we put in it. And then they would look at the Ford, Chevy, or Toyota in their garage and go, the hell with that. I'm getting one of these coveralls in a motorcycle so I can stop driving these stupid cars. And then I would be the next Henry Ford. Well, the reality was that more than 100 people a year wanted them, and a lot less than, nowhere near that. Everybody basically still wanted to use motorcycles as toys and sports vehicles. That's the first question. So I did have a best case, worst case in a fantasy sense. What was the second question? Please tell me again. I'm sorry.
Oh gosh, no, I've forgotten. Just competing products. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. There was I came into motorcycling right on the cusp of what I personally feel is the golden age of motorcycling in advanced parts of the world, like America, Canada, and Japan. The guys 3-4 years older than me wore leather jackets, were the Fonzie or Marlon Brando stereotype, and they talked about and rode and worked on relatively crappy BSAs, Triumphs, and Harleys. And I started on a Honda 90 in 1969 or 70, and that thing had a great headlight. It never broke down. I went to see First Run Easy Rider in a big theater one night on my Honda 90, the first year I was a legal rider. and most people, if anyone in your audience does not know how Easy Rider ends, it does not end well for those guys, without being a spoiler too much. And in the dark, coming home from that theater on my Honda 90, I was scared to death. And because you know how Easy Rider ends.
I know how it ends. I think we can assume that most of our audience knows how it ends.
Okay, well,
so you thought you were going to get shot by yahoos in a pickup truck?
On my Honda 90, it was about a 10-mile ride home from the downtown theater in the dark, and of course the little Honda kickstart only, and I was pretty scared coming home from Easy Rider as a 16-year-old kid. But that was the way the younger riders, my exact generation, dressed compared to the kids 2 or 3 years older than me, 4 years older than me. We all dressed in windbreakers and T-shirts like the Beach Boys and Steve McQueen and stuff like that. Nylon windbreakers were cool and they always had a double racing stripe or a triple racing stripe on one side. And then the guys with the Triumphs and the BSAs and the old school motorcycle guys at the Harley shops with grease under their fingernails, they wore a zippered leather jacket, a Langlet's if they were rich, or a Bates or a Schott or a Bucco. And I didn't have any interest at all in what they were doing. It was almost like two different worlds. There was a real cleavage point or fracture point or fulcrum point in motorcycling when the Japanese came. And you know the story. I don't know if everybody in your audience knows the story. You can maybe fill in the blanks. But when Honda was making a presentation as they were starting out in America to somebody like the importer of Triumphs or something, and this is a legendary meeting, and they said to the importer, "Oh, yeah, we're planning on selling 2,500 or 3,500 bikes in America." And the Triumph guy said something like, 3,500 bikes in 1 year? That's not possible. You'll never do that. And the Japanese guy said, "No, we were thinking a month."
Right.
So it was, there's details. That's not exactly the right story, but the point is there was a cleavage or a tipping point or something that shifted. And then the years from 1968, 69, 70 through to 2008, motorcycling in North America went upward at a very steep angle from sales of, I don't know, 50,000 a year up to 1 million a year in that 30-year period or 40-year period.
So you sort
Completely
of
different.
essentially you rode the Aerostich sort of rode the wave, didn't it? I mean, you were
Yeah,
fortunate
yeah.
that you
Our
hit.
sales always tracked with new bike sales, and that's a historians are going to call that period a golden age because sales since 2008 have fallen back down in America to about 450,000 a year.
Yeah.
They've fallen by more than half.
eBay Motors is here for the ride. Now, this is the part of the show where I tell you a story, and if it's interesting, that's even better. And so I'm going to tie it to our guest, Andy Goldfine. And I have a pair of combat boots that I got from Andy a number of years ago. And I absolutely adore these boots. And there's a story behind it because with Andy, there's a story behind everything. So these are, they're more robust than a street riding boot, but they're not goofy like a motocross boot, which is absolute overkill if you're touring on your ADV bike. And there's a nice height. They protect the ankle. And the first time I wore these, they weren't broken in. So I got them from Andy, put them on and ran to get a pizza, like literally ran up the street to get a pizza. And they ripped all the flesh off the back of my heels rather. And I was in absolute agony and cursed them and actually didn't wear them for a while. I was so petty about it. And then I broke down and started wearing them, a little bit at a time. Because remember you used to have to break in shoes? And you don't do that anymore. You just put them on and they're like new. I don't know why that is. Andy would probably say the materials aren't as good. And he'd probably be right because he seems to be right about most things. So, but then I wore them over time and they got wet a few times, well, more than a few times. And then they really molded to my feet. They're the most comfortable thing. They're like my favorite pair of worn out underwear. I shouldn't admit that. But there's kind of a sad story because CD, the Italian company, SIDA, that brand, they used to make them to Andy's design, but then they stopped making them for him. And he's been trying for years, since I think 2008 or something like that, to get them done to his specification. And he can't get them done. So there are no more combat touring boots. So there you go. Sorry, nice story. Now a word from our sponsor. With over 122 million parts, you can make sure your number one ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof racks, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber and not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. Now back to my conversation with Andy Goldfine. You're listening to The Lowdown Show. Back to this question of starting your company, Aerostich. I mean, I still find it sort of audacious that as you talked about, people, the guys older than you were wearing leather jackets. Kids your age were wearing nylon windbreakers with 3 racing stripes, looking like Steve McQueen, which is a good look if you can pull it off. And when you're young,
It is.
You can pull it off.
Yep.
But what you came up with wasn't in the middle of those two things. It was something. No. It was more. It seemed more like sort of fishing in Lake Superior aesthetic than it was a traditional motorcycle aesthetic. It's pure sort of function over form, isn't it?
Yeah, I wanted the utility. My goal was and remains: how do you put a motorcycle into more days of your life? How do you ride more? And it's not always, in the same with bicyclists, it's just not always a perfect weather day. And I didn't care. I wanted a tool, a piece of equipment to help address that. Easy and fast to get in and out of. I didn't care if it was sacrificial in a crash, but I wanted to be able to, if I lost it in the freeway off-ramp and slid over into the turf, I wanted to be able to pick the bike up and finish going to work. That never happened to me, but it happened to lots of our customers. Antifreeze on the surface of the pavement or whatever. But the idea is, how do you ride more days of your life? For me, that's what I wanted. And the only way to do that was an easy to get on and off coverall with some abrasion resistance, some venting, and some impact armor.
Of course, Aerostich is your story, and your story is so much intertwined with the brand. I don't think anyone who buys one of your suits can tell the difference between you and the suit. And there's sort of a political, which is no reflection on how you appear, so don't get self-conscious. But there is a political sort of aspect to this as well, isn't it? Because you mentioned that Duluth was losing its manufacturing base, as happened when everything went offshore.
Most of America over the last 40. I can't remember the geopolitical term or the Reaganomics, trickle down, whatever it was, global free trade. There's a bunch of reasons why these things happen.
So why was it important to you, or was it important to you to make it in Duluth? And what's behind this? Is it ultimately a romantic notion that you could have sewers sewing in Duluth? I mean, what's behind it?
There was a sewing industry here, like in many places in America, that had a lot of skilled workers. I think there was about 2,000 people sewing in Duluth, making Mackinac jackets and wool stuff. And so there was a labor pool of unemployed people. There was, my father was a very strong Duluth booster. I'm a third generation American. My grandparents were first generation Americans. They came from Ukraine, Lithuania, Russia, and I think Poland was the four grandparents, all in that same area. And they ended up here. And my grandfather, or my great grandfather, was one of those guys who came out of the Fiddler on the Roof life with 2 cows and his dairy. And my father was a great patriotic World War II era guy who loved this town. And I must have absorbed some of that because I like it.
No, I find it interesting because now we are, especially a college graduate like yourself, young guy, smart, wants to make his way in the world. I find it kind of curious that you, and you sort of hinted at it, your father's devotion to Duluth, but that you decided to stick it through and stay there. I mean, are you stubborn by nature, or did you?
I'm an Aries, so yes.
So you thought, damn it, I'm just going to stay in Duluth and I'm going to do it here, and you've no intention of leaving.
If I figure it out and I make money here, then maybe I might go later. But I didn't want to give myself permission to go until, and I was so insecure that for 40 years, building up Aerostich up until 6 years ago, I didn't own a house here. I rented.
Really?
Yeah.
Just in case it didn't work out.
Correct.
Which leads me.
I paid a mortgage for the landlord 3 times, I think, where I figured it out.
But you own a house now?
I do.
Or you live in the factory?
No, own a house. Got a wife now, too. Wife and a house.
So finally, after all these years, you're a proper American.
Pretty much. Trying, doing my best.
Take me through some of those early years at Aerostich. I can assume that selling a product that no one, is familiar with, and you said you mentioned earlier you were ridiculed by magazine people who supposedly,
and lots of serious writers also.
Serious writers. And so, was it touch and go for a while? And did you ever question yourself that making unusual riding suits from northern Minnesota was a sound idea?
It has never been not touch and go. I think the nature of many non-formula based small businesses are perpetually touch and go. You want to franchise a hamburger restaurant or a Subway sandwich restaurant, that is a formula that you can count on if you put one in the right location. And those aren't touch and go small businesses. And millions of small business people own those type of businesses, operate those type of businesses. But ones where you are creating the business out of sort of whole cloth, every one of them that I'm aware of is always on the edge of disaster. But we've been very fortunate. For most of the 40 years, maybe 2/3 of them, we were solvent and in the black, although not getting a lot of profit, but enough to pay the bills. I still, after 41 years, owe money on a loan for the business still. So, but it's been the other side of that is the human side. My top operations person running the business, I'm not particularly great at running the business part. And the top person that's been running the business has been with me for 33 years. The top guy with the engineering degree who takes care of our computers and our building, got a double major engineer. He's been with me for 27 years. And he's ridden the high banks racing at Daytona. And I've got another half a dozen people who've been with Aerostich for 15, 20 years or longer. So that's the best part about the business as I look back on it, is not that I got a giant amount of money, but I've never missed a meal. And I get to come to work with people that, although I'm not socially friendly with, I like. And if in a thought experiment way, if I didn't know them through coworker relationships, I could be friends with a third or half the people that I work with. And philosophically, I worked for people I didn't like before I started Aerostich. And I wasn't intentionally trying to build a business where the people would all get along and that I would like, but that is the result. And that's been a very priceless result.
Styles in clothing change, and motorcycling is not immune to that as well. If you look at a Alpine Stars jacket from 30 years ago, no one would be caught dead wearing it today because it would be ridiculous. Or some of those HJC with the hideous leathers, from the 90s.
Yep.
How do you exist in this fickle marketplace with a product that's intentionally, these are my words, maybe you can correct me, but it's sort of styleless in a way, which is maybe a style of its own. But do your fortunes change with what's going on around you, or are you immune to trends?
Fortunes do change with what's going on around. The examples from outside of motorcycling are products like the rubber bottom, leather top LL Bean hunting shoe, or those go in and out of fashion every 15 or 20 years, and then they see a spike in sales. A lot of products are like that. I looked at what our capacity was to manufacture stuff and realized that we couldn't be successful if we tried to do annual or every 2-year fashion changes. So we had to be like Schott or Langlets or Belstaff with their wax cotton jacks. We had to build something that was a piece of equipment, and maybe it would some days be in fashion and some days it wouldn't be in fashion, but we couldn't be on that annual treadmill. What happened in our 40-year existence as a maker and seller of clothing is that it all went to Asia, and the costs became so low to make clothing that there's a term called fast fashion, which has nothing specifically to do with the motorcycle industry, but every mall in the world is full of Asian-made, inexpensive clothing that changes every 6 to 24 months. There's a supply chain that supports all of that. I knew we couldn't play in that. That's not my skill set, isn't the business and the deal making. And I looked at products that were clothing products that were sort of timeless, and saw things like I mentioned a minute ago, and hoped that I could establish our products like those other products, that they would just be what they would be, pieces of utility or functional equipment. Today, there's so much profit in the clothing that if you go into a ski shop or a golfing pro shop or a motorcycle store, they're basically all clothing stores now, with, in the case of motorcycling, some motorcycles on the side or some skis over there and bindings. When you and I were starting our careers as riders, motorcycle shops never had any clothing. They had mufflers and batteries and oil and chemicals and hand grips and things to keep the bike going. And if you wanted clothing, you sometimes had to order it. When I was in high school, wanted a motorcycle jacket, a serious motorcycle jacket. And I remember ordering from some mail order catalog a wax cotton Belstaff Trials Master jacket. Because there was no way to get that jacket in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, anywhere that I knew. Motorcycle stores were hard parts and oils. Today, motorcycle stores are clothing stores that happen to have a few motorcycles because that's where the profit is. And in order to keep that going, they have to have new styles, new colorways, new every year. That's what makes all of the companies we are, I would say, not really competing with, but all of the products that we're comparable with change every 15 months or 6 months or on some sort of schedule. So they do look obsolete after a few years, and 10 years out, they look ridiculously obsolete. But our suits, although no two pieces of them are the same internally, they were intentionally made to look the same so that one that's 20 years old looks just like one that's just made. You have to look close and know what to look for to see all the internal differences, but they're deliberately made the same to look the same as a part of a business. I don't want to say marketing strategy as much as a business survival strategy based on what our capabilities are.
In the 40 plus years that you've been in business, the median age of motorcyclists has changed dramatically. Mm-hmm. Pretty much every year, a 22-year-old motorcyclist in 1983 is a 32-year-old motorcyclist in 1993, and on it's gone. Has that affected your business, and if so, in what ways?
That's affected the cultural changes in the world as a result of the digital revolution, where everybody has a smartphone and everything is online, like we are right now, have changed. There's been just in our lifetime, yours and mine, and probably most of this audience, the changes have been enormous, and I'm not able to put a capsulized description of them. Young people they see the world through different lenses and experiences than we do, not better or worse. I will say that I miss the more analog world that I grew up in. And I used to love making our catalog. When you hold a book or a print magazine or a print catalog, you see the context, so that it's not just a helmet on a page in a catalog or a glove. It's a helmet or a glove on a page in a catalog within a context of all this other products, and you're holding it in your hands. So you see context, and what is a universal human experience is to see the world and process the world always with a context. So in this shot, you've got my hand tools and stuff on behind me, you've got a context. But when you go on the internet for information, or you go on a navigation program in your car or on a GPS on your handlebars of your bike, there's no context. It's very efficient. It drills directly down to what you want to know. And one of the ways that the algorithms that do that work is to remove all the extraneous context. And yet, we're analog beings, at least at the conscious level. And so we understand the world with context. And once you remove context, when you're planning a road trip, or there's a difference between looking at an unfolded paper map or a big page of a road atlas and looking at the screen on a nav program. The way I don't know if it's evolved or how we came to be this way, but we are this way. We understand the world in terms of context, and the internet and the digital revolution has removed a lot of that from our lives. And young people who grew up with a screen in their hands or in their face don't see the world the same way that people my age do or your age do, if that makes any sense.
Well, I think that you talked about extraneous content. You seem like a man who loves going off on seemingly unrelated tangents. But
Sorry.
personally and professionally. No, I like that. It's a term of endearment. Um, but when you would get your old catalog, and I remember seeing your old catalog, it was kind of a quirky trip through your brain, um, for
I
better or
loved it.
worse.
Yes.
But it was amusing, and it just you got the sense of an absolute individual running this business in northern Duluth, and it seemed absurd to me when I first heard your story, and yet it's such an endearing tale. Um, and
Thank
yet
you.
I wonder if you, going from your traditional catalog to now selling online, is there a less of an Andy Goldfine influence over Aerostich in the way that there once was?
I believe there is. And again, I'm a child of the analog world and can't help that. That's how I process my life experiences every day, for better or for worse. It just is. It is different. And so younger people are not as interested as you and I were at having the analog physical experiences of taking care of, maintaining, using, and exploring the world with a motorcycle. They just aren't. And I don't understand exactly why that is, but I think the logistical complexity is challenging. I don't want to say it's worse or better. It's just so different now.
Do you think that
And
do you think that travel has lost its romance, and maybe it's tied with our awareness of what burning fuel can do in terms of what it does to the environment?
good
Um,
question. I
I
don't
wonder
know.
if there's just because my daughter, excuse me, when my daughter was young, I bought a VW bus, and I thought we're going to go down into Vermont and New Hampshire, and we're going to have the time of her life. And she had, as it turned out, absolutely no interest in going anywhere. She would now, of course, part of that is just your child has to disagree with everything you're interested in. So maybe I didn't sell it well enough to her, but she'd be okay about flying to Paris. But the idea of going in an old VW bus had absolutely no appeal to her. And I think a lot of her generation, she's 19 now, a lot of her generation just doesn't feel that romance of getting out and going like maybe you and I did. Because, a motorcycle or a car, just getting in a car and going on a Sunday afternoon with my father was just seemed to me full of promise. The idea, I always kind of wanted to be in motion.
Yeah, my dad would come home. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Please tell me.
My dad would come home from work. We'd eat dinner, and then he'd say, "Who wants to go for a ride?" And we would all jump in the car and drive around and look at stuff together. Growing, that was part of it. I think you're correct, but I can't tell you what it means. But it does affect how many people are interested in playing with motorcycles. Now, there's a difference in how America and Canada and the other rich countries consume motorcycling, and how the developing parts of the world, all of Asia and India, and in the developing parts of the world, motorcycles are utility, mobility for people who can't afford cars. And also, many of the cities in developing parts of the world are very crowded, and there's no sprawled out infrastructure. And so a 100cc scooter works great. And so there's a different kind of motorcycling in North America, or in, I would say, Canada and Mexico. I mean, Canada and the US only. Our history with motorcycling is radically different than that of Europe and all the rest of the world because of Henry Ford. In 1918 or 17 or 16, Henry Ford said, "Here's a four-wheeled vehicle you can buy for $400. And Harley and Indian said, "Here's a two-wheeled vehicle you can buy for $400. And people looked at him and said, "Are you nuts? I'm taking the four wheels for $400. And so we uniquely went right to cars. And motorcycles were never in any significant way in a utility mobility role. All the rest of the world had a different experience than we did because of Henry Ford's innovation in mass production, metallurgy, and building automobiles to make them as cheap as a bike.
Do you worry that your customer will age out? Where will
Well,
Aerostich be in 20 years?
our business is a lot smaller than it was pre-2008. It's been very challenging to reduce the size of the business without going bankrupt. Uh, I inherited a nice little, not gigantic amount of money, but a nice little amount of money. And I felt that I was enjoying my life enough. So I put a lot of that inheritance into the business to keep it going as we downsized it. Um, and it's been holding its own now without life support for a number of years. But without that, I don't know if it would be around, because it is extremely difficult to shrink a business without killing a business. But I had, as I said earlier, great team of people working with me who were very loyal and tolerant and committed as I was to keeping it going.
Give me a sense of some of the oddball stuff in your catalog. Do you still print an actual physical edition of
We
your
do print
catalog?
an actual physical catalog, but instead of trying to make the world, I used to call my world, uh, this is before I had any psychological counseling, I used to say I lived on Andy's planet. And this was a place like the planet that the Little Prince in the French storybook, where it was a motorcycle planet. And I wanted our catalog to reflect, as you've noted, sort of Andy's planet. I wanted it to be the world writ whole. And the catalog we have today, for financial reasons and survival reasons, is not a shadow of that catalog, but it's a very curated, refined. It's only like 36 pages in the old, or something like that. And the old catalogs were 250 pages or 300 pages, divided into sections like chapters in a book. All the stuff you need to keep your bike maintained, all the clothing over here, all the camping stuff over there. And now it's just sort of the stuff we make is the majority of it in this little catalog. And we used to print several 100,000 copies and mail them every year, and now it's a couple thousand copies a year or less. It's just mainly so that somebody who says, "Can I have a copy of your catalog?" we have something to hand them. It's not a center of our marketing efforts at all. But I love making it because it, again, provides context to whoever's got it in their hands about how to consume motorcycling implied. And that's what the big catalogs did much better than the little catalog. And it's a fun process to make. It's like telling a story. I don't think I answered all of your question, though. But
Well, no, it seems, but there was just a little bit younger than you, but it seemed like there was a thing in the 70s where, there was that hand-drawn illustrations about how to keep your Volkswagen running forever.
Exactly. That was a best-selling book.
Yeah, and it was, and I can't remember the guy's name who did it, but he had these wonderful illustrations, and there was a beautiful one of a man, like a full page. I actually have the book somewhere. My brother gave it to me, but there's a man lying in bed and his wife is asleep and his eyes are wide open, and in his head he just has all these parts from his disassembled engine,
right,
in a thought bubble above his head. So that sort of stuff, I assume that was sort of the inspiration for the original Aerostich catalog.
Yeah, I wanted to. What's always been central is, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, I rode enduros and got plastic trophies for a couple of years before starting Aerostich, and had a blast sliding a motorcycle around and I put a big front brake on my XR650L that's been lowered and motarded so I can do stoppies, and I like the fun aspects of the nimbleness and immediacy of the controls on a motorcycle very, very much. But at the end of the day, it's all about riding. How many days a year can you ride? Not even how many miles for me. It's a cathartic experience to be on a motorcycle. There's an old joke, which I think is pretty dumb. They say there's no motorcycles parked in front of psychiatrists' offices or something like that. I think that joke aside, I have the best part of my day, any day that I ride, no matter what else is going on, is the ride for me. I can't speak for anybody else.
If you'd like to see the inside of Andy Goldfine's head, you can do so at aerostich.com. That's Aerostich. They also have products you can buy. In closing, a word from our sponsor. eBay Motors is here for the ride. With some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber and not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions naturally apply. Thank you for listening to The Lowdown Show.